But uh, so yeah, let's talk about the Nordic ideology. Maybe with that dark rain cloud hanging over us. So the Nordic Ideology is the second book in the Metamodern Guide to the Guide to Politics series. It's written by this pseudonymous author Hanzi who we talked about last time. It's actually two individual authors. And the book offers an overview of what metamodern sociology and politics ought to look like. So, if you'll remember the first volume in the series, The Listening Society, which we've already read, that book was generally composed of two parts. So, the first part was an explanation of metamodernism and why it's needed. And the second part of that first book laid out a sort of model of personal development that societies should aspire to have their populations strive for and go through. So a core tenet of metamodern politics is that societies are only as good as their individual members, and yet that these individual members are only as good as the society's institutions allow them to be. So there's something of a self-reinforcing mechanism here, and I think we're always going to want to sort of return to thinking about it in this way. It's not just one causes the other, but they kind of cause each other, like the M.C. Escher drawing of the hands drawing each other. So the last book was about the stages of development of the individual with this within this sort of transpersonal equation. And this book is about the institutional side, so offering a map and a plan, in Hanzi's words, for better social structures and politics. And as Hanzi puts it, quote, the last book gave you an introduction to developmental psychology, whereas this book presents you with a developmental sociology and then links it to concrete political plan of how you change society. Okay, so that's fundamentally what we'll be talking about when we read and discuss this book. And today we're just covering part one, so I think up till about page 170, something like that. So the Nordic ideology is divided into three parts. So part one, which we're talking about today, it's a section specifically on sort of social institutions and how they develop. Then part two is about metamodern politics. And then part three, which is about this idea of a Nordic ideology, which is sort of like he's proving where this is happening in a prefigurative way. So we're just going to talk about the first part of the book today and the introduction to the book. So starting with the introduction, Hanzi tells us right out of the gate that, quote, the previous book, The Listening Society, wasn't all that good or important. All it really gives us is an argument in favor of psychological development and an exploration of what psychological development should look like. He says, quote, there are a few innovations in that book, but they aren't that big. He also says the present volume, which he sort of reassures us, is different. So we should read the previous volume as an introduction, he says, to the Nordic ideology. In this book, he says, presents you with an actual to-do plan to save the world. This is where it gets real. Welcome. So this is a big, audacious sell that he uses to open up the book. So after this, Hanzi gets into the way that human civilization is increasingly having to face its own limitations in the form of natural barriers like ecological crises and climate change. And these demand not only scientific innovations, but also social and political innovations. And he thinks the latter of these, political and social innovations, are sort of neglected in our society. We tend to try to look for technical fixes to our problems when there are all these social and political innovations that we also need. So in order to tackle the latter of these, he insists we need to understand, quote, what it means for humans to grow and flourish, and we need to know the logic of how societies develop, end quote. He also says that, quote, the very social fabric of everyday life can and must be intelligently developed. And this is the essence of political metamodernism. So he's not just looking at some, abstract principles. He really sees politics as being rooted in everyday life. And I think that's really important to the metamodern project. So right away then, and this is core to the methodology deployed through the book, he is simultaneously taking a scientific approach based on hard limitations. He's being realistic about those. And a social constructionist approach based on the prospects of change, growth, and development. And I'll touch more on this in a minute when we talk about his ideas about sort of avoiding what he calls game denialism. But anyway, he calls this methodology of being both realistic and sort of social constructivist He calls this being a realistic utopian. In the end of the introduction of the book, he insists that we must be effortful and attentive readers and implementers of the plan and the book that he lays out, but he also insists that we should be critical and suspicious of him, the author, which is characteristic of this fictional author's sort of rather goofy, mysterious style, and no doubt some kind of mind trick that he's playing on us. So he's notifying us that we should be aware, which is funny. Anyway, on to part one. So part one is called The Map, How Society Develops. And it is fundamentally about Hanzi thinks the history of society is moving. That is, society's sort of developmental trajectory. So this section of the book begins by offering insight into why we should take his developmental theory and trajectory seriously. And culminates with Hanzi's reflections on how we should embrace, with this in mind, a new vision for the state. Or sort of a better, and in addition to this, a better vision for freedom and a better vision for democracy, of equality within democracy, and ultimately a better system of norms and values. So norms and values, then freedom, order, and equality, and those are going to be paired with what he gave us before, which is this sort of theory of psychological development. And we'll talk more about how all those things integrate at the end. But part one begins with a breakdown of what Hanzi calls attractors, the things that move and shake society. So to understand what he means by attractors, we need to remember, and we talked about this when we discussed the previous volume in the series, we need to remember that Hanzi has a certain understanding of reality that is more attuned to, quote, potentials and potentiality than to, quote, facts and actualities. So those are quotes from the previous volume of the book series. What he says is, quote, what happens in the present is namely just as much a result of what has been as what can become. So attractors are a concrete way that that the potential acts upon the actual. So the difference, he says, between a flawed political project and a successful one is that successful ones get the attractors right. That is the way that these actual potentials, or these potentials are able to act on the actual. And this demands a particular type of temporal thinking. So historians take note here. Whereas the amateur, he says, studies how the present has been shaped by the past to foresee the future, he inveighs the pro studies how the future is already shaping the present. So great change makers, he tells us, had clear understandings of the way that the future exerts a kind of gravitational effect upon the present, that developments in the present in certain ways are pulled toward the unrealized potentials of the future. Attractors, then, are the pulls that the unfulfilled potentials of the future exercise over the present. So potentials basically seeking what he calls an equilibrium. So examples that he gives are agriculture, electricity, and digitization. These are historical examples. So once the technical capabilities for implementing these regimes of societal organization became possible, the full development of their capabilities became nearly irresistible and very likely, he says. And so similar tendencies are at work today. We've just created some innovations, say, with the internet, with there's negative things like climate change and so forth, and these are attractors. These are going to pull the direction that we move in. Nevertheless, these attractors should not be understood as features of some kind of deterministic pathway that society had to take. So this is not a determinism in the same way as you might think of determinism. It's not that the existence of these things was predetermined, Hanzi clarifies, but that at certain points in history, particular paths become more likely than others. So the pro senses the changes in the wind, the actual changes in the wind, and can see the signs pointing to where things are likely to go. So in a sense, Hanzi explains, this is a deeply Darwinist concept. Certain structures are the most likely to survive and outcompete other structures under the currently emerging historical circumstances. And it is this process that we must become literate in if we're going to be able to see where things go from here. Okay, so that's attractors. And so in the next chapter, entitled Relative Utopia, Hanzi reminds us that things change, and generally for the better. I mean, that's the big takeaway. We live, he says, in a, quote, relative utopia that's much better than the past in some ways, and also more treacherous in certain new ways, namely tremendous threats posed by ecological unsustainability, the dangers and injustices of excess inequality, and the stress and alienation of modern life. These are all things he points to there. However, rather than throwing the baby of historical development out with the bathwater of contemporary problems, Hanzi insists that we need a nuanced stock-taking of our contemporary position. We must sort between the problems we face as well as the gains we've made. Problems should be sorted, he says, into the following three categories, therefore. The first is what he calls residual problems, meaning problems that are sort of left over from before modernity, modernity being the stage that we're currently in, more or less. So that's the first category, residual problems. The next is new emergent properties problems, which refers to problems caused by modernity. And then a third category, sorry, he has four categories. The third category is beauties lost, which refers to positive things that have been lost under modernity. And then finally, think about the romanticists here, I would say. And then finally, new heights reached, meaning the problems that we were unable to even approach to solve before, that we now have been able to solve because of modernity. Okay, so those are the sort of four categories of problems. So these four categories would exist under a meta-modern organization of society too, it's important to note. But the problems populating what these categories are, they're going to differ from paradigm to paradigm, or societal organization to societal organization. So the problems that we have now would no doubt need to be solved, he said, in order for us to progress to the meta-modern. But at that point, we would have new problems, at which point it'd be useful to sort them into these four baskets. And that's why, for him, utopia is always relative, because you're always going to have problems. It's going to be much better, just like living today is much better than living 500 years ago, but you're still going to have problems, just as we do today still have problems, even if we've solved many of the problems from 500 years ago. Okay, so moving on to the next chapter, Hanzi introduces the idea of game change. So as I mentioned earlier, Hanzi possesses a kind of constrained social constructivism. So it's not just social construction without constraints. There are constraints. You need to be aware of them. And some of those constraints / tendencies that you need to be aware of and are realistic about are attractors. And then also these very difficult problems that arise within a particular form of societal organization. So constraints that he thinks social construction always needs to face. You're not doing this on a tabula rasa, blank slate with no constraints. There are constraints. So he tackles these constraints head on in his chapter on game change. So we are, he tells us, always threatened by two extremes. On the one hand, you have game denial, and on the other hand, you have game acceptance. And both are ways of being ignorant, he says, of attractors and or constraints, if you want to think of those as different or similar. So game denial fails to recognize the kind of zero-sum processes and structures that are at work, or the kinds of power relations that we may be stuck in within a given moment, denying that they even exist. Game deniers fundamentally deny the actual in favor of the possible, he says. They are consequently kind of floating in their own mental delusion or fantasy, usually animated by pure moralism. It fails, though, to see the pragmatics or logistics involved in system change. Game acceptance, on the other hand, has the opposite problem. So whereas game denial neglects the constraints of the actual in favor of pure potentiality, game acceptance neglects the potential in favor of pure actuality. So what actually exists already, looking backwards rather than forwards. So in other words, it is the staunchly conservative view that things must necessarily continue to be the way that they are now or have been in the past, and that's the only way they can ever be. As Hanzi says, quote, "The central principle of game acceptance is that which could be is but is not, and hence it should not be." This perspective enacts what he says is a tremendous violence upon the future. As Hanzi says, crimes against potentiality are crimes against humanity. And I loved that. So too often, Hanzi says, Hanzi seems to imply, our political positions fit into one of these two opposing camps. So naive, moralistic, let's say liberal game denialism, or staunch, unimaginative, let's say conservative game acceptance. And Hanzi insists that the reason we adopt these usually is not conscious, but an effect of our existing identity positions that we have adopted, perhaps in opposition to the identity, the opposite identity block formation that we oppose. So we have these sort of oppositional identities that are kind of frozen in this sort of gridlock. And it's really hard to get out of those identity positions. So metamodern politics, in contrast, seeks to change the game. Okay, so this is the third option, one that he advocates, is game change. Neither by denying its existence or by insisting that it is immutable. Our simple message, Hanzi insists, is that everyday life as we know it can and must evolve. So this means that we must recognize that life can be, quote, a plus-sum game with possible win-wins. And yet it might sometimes also be a zero-sum game with loss-wins outcomes. And it is also sometimes even a tragic dilemma of lose-lose. But nevertheless, the rules of the game can change, and Hanzi offers a kind of ethics here. It is, he says, our ethical imperative, without compromise, to change the rules of the game. So the goal should be to change it in ways that create more win-win scenarios and that, quote, softens the fall of the losers when there are inevitable losses, while also, quote, making people act kindlier and more fairly while playing the game. So softening the fall of the losers, making more wins possible, and also being kinder to each other in the process. So in other words, not only must winning become more widely available, but also losing must become far less destructive. So Hanzi ends this chapter by offering a sneak preview into the game and how it needs to be changed at multiple levels at once. So this makes the change a, quote, developmental affair, he says. Changes in one area precipitate further changes. You can't, Hanzi explains, just develop society by means of imposing a certain political system or changing people's values in isolation. Game change occurs by means of systemic change, psychological development of the population, changes in habits and behaviors, and through cultural development, all at the same time. And again, we'll talk about how these integrate at the end. Okay, so this constitutes Hanzi's general abstract theory of change and development. And the rest of the chapters apply this theory to a series of particular spheres of society. So the state and the social order that produces and protects. That's the first one. The second one is the domain of freedom. And then the third one is the domain of equality. So the next parts are going to move a bit faster because they are a bit more straightforward. So in chapter 3, Hanzi examines the evolution of the state and its quest for social and political order. So according to Hanzi, there is a clear directionality to this evolution. Control, he says, becomes increasingly intimate over time. This rule, Hanzi says, holds that the polity, viewed as an emergent pattern of governance among humans, keeps evolving in ways that increase the monitoring and control of human behaviors by reaching into deeper layers of the human soul and putting it under deliberate collective control. So if you've read Foucault's work, especially his book Discipline and Punish, you'll be familiar with this concept. While state power has become less and less repressive over time, according to Foucault, it has become increasingly pervasive and increasingly effective and efficient because it no longer needs to threaten violence in order to shape human behaviors. Increasingly, people want to do what power wants them to do. And this is what Foucault means by his concept of governmentality. It's where you basically, in your subjectivity itself, want what power wants you to want. And there's a little resistance there. So Hanzi criticizes Foucault for merely offering resistance to this process. Foucault's critical of governmentality, Foucault's critical of discipline, Foucault's critical of power, rather than embracing its positive aspects. So the point, Hanzi tells us, should not be, quote, to avoid any control, but to avoid bad, unscientific, corrupt, or despotic control. So on this basis, Hanzi seeks to go a step further than Foucault, and Foucault may have done this later in his life. I think he was already flirting with this in his later project, but anyway, we won't get into that. Hanzi insists that as order increases, freedom and equality may also increase. Quote, this increased control, he tells us, makes it possible the civil liberties, human rights, and liberal culture we currently enjoy. So they're not antagonistic to each other. They actually develop hand in hand, he says. So in classic Hanzi fashion, he trots out a developmental theory of the state wherein order, freedom, and equality have evolved together. The state has evolved from the, quote, early modern state to the nation state to the welfare state, and it will, he anticipates, finally evolve into what he hopes anyway, the listening society. In each of these developments, Hanzi insists, while power has generally become softer and more humane, it has also become more pervasive. and less escapable. Yet, according to Hanzi, as this power becomes more pervasive, it also becomes less invested in the particular forms that people's lives and personalities and identities must take in some ways. So somewhat counterintuitively, as control and societal integration grow, so does individuation. So people become increasingly unique, but this also brings with it, he says, he mentioned that we're going to have new problems. Well, this brings with it new problems. Having to do with alienation and invisibility, and perhaps anonymity as well, which he explores in the following chapters a bit. Okay, so the next two chapters are about freedom and defining a series of stages within which freedom becomes increasingly refined. So the first of these chapters seeks to define, quote, another kind of freedom. So one that centers the inner emotional experience of people. Which of course is really important to this concept of the listening society. So as we talked about in our discussion of the listening society, the point of metamodern politics should be to improve fundamentally the subjective states of citizens. So correspondingly, as Hanzi points out in this volume, freedom must be felt in order to be real. And I think that's very appropriate for our affect theory reading group. So according to Hanzi, negative emotions tend to be used to regulate people's behaviors within what he calls emotional regimes, which steer us to sort of certain socially desirable behaviors and prevent socially undesirable behaviors. Let me just say these emotional regimes are loosely tied to those different types of formations of the state, I might say. Like all of his stages have some sort of cross connections and cross indexing. So it's just worth keeping that in mind. But anyway, so an emotional regime is about sort of steering us by causing sort of negative feelings when we do sort of antisocial behaviors. So, and emotional regimes take several forms, he says, which have more or less evolved in these stages. So these regimes are enforced socially within what he calls an emotional ecology, where we seek to avoid negative emotions caused by others, and therefore each regime is sort of associated with both a series of transmitted regulative emotions and also received regulative emotions. So let me elaborate on this a bit. In its crudest stage, hatred, rage, and aggression are transmitted by the other when norms are violated. And this causes fear and terror to be received on the part of the self, right? In the next stage up, so that's the most crude and uncomfortable stage. In the next stage up, judgment and moral outrage in the other cause guilt and feelings of impurity in the self. Another rung up, disdain, contempt, and ridicule cause shame and embarrassment in the self. And then in the most advanced sort of pre-metamodern stage, in the stage that we're currently entering in our postmodern world, he says, envy, jealousy, and Schadenfreude cause what Hanzi calls Sklavenmoral, or internalized envy. And also elements of narcissism, which we'll talk about in a minute. So as we move up within this spectrum of judgment, one never becomes free of judgments of others. They're always there. But the experience of these judgments does become increasingly humane. Yet, these emotions also exist within a sort of hierarchy that continues to exist. Similar to sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we will do nearly anything, including feeling guilt and impurity, to avoid feeling fear and terror. And we will risk feeling shame and embarrassment to avoid feeling guilt and impurity, etc., etc. And so that's how they exist in a hierarchy. It's not that you can't feel fear and terror in today's world. It's just that less of us are feeling that on an everyday basis as a way of steering our behavior. We're more likely to be making our decisions, especially people in this room, based on trying to avoid envy, right? Or maybe one stage down, we don't want to look stupid or something. Okay, so what does this have to do with freedom? Well, in any society, you need to reconcile freedom from and freedom to. And we'll get a bit more into this in the next chapter. But in order to secure people's freedom from, you need a certain amount of norm or regulation in a society. Freedom, Hanzi insists, is a collective good. We are freed together or not at all. And this means that freedom needs to be seen, quote, as a matter of collective transpersonal development. And we talked about transpersonal in our previous discussions. So therefore, emotional regimes are here to stay in one form or another. It's not like we're going to ever get over emotional regimes. We have to be realistic about this fact. But what Hanzi's arguing is that we should push for kinder versions of these, and we should push for people to dwell in the kinder canopy of these emotional regimes, which means accessing a higher version of freedom. That's what he means by a higher version of freedom. You're never actually free in the sense that you just get to do whatever you want. Ideally, yeah, your experience of regulation becomes softer. So when one of these modes of emotional regulation is dominant within a society, it constitutes a particular type of regime, and we can and should seek to ascend the ladder, he says, from fear regimes to guilt regimes to shame regimes and beyond. All right, so that's that chapter. So the fifth chapter opens by considering that we are presently moving from a shame regime to what Hanzi calls a postmodern Sklavenmoral regime, based upon the regulative effects of envy. And the chapter spends some time analyzing how this works in contemporary society, because this is the most advanced emotional regime and the one that we will finally need to overcome on our way to meta-modern freedom. So one of the consequences of envy increasingly taking hold in our society is that people resent greatness in others. As Hanzi says, if we look deep within ourselves, most of us will find that while we certainly don't wish harm on anybody else, we don't really generally wish them resounding success in life either. We prefer, he says, that other people get about the same amount of happiness and success as ourselves, preferably slightly less, if we're really honest with ourselves. So the great challenge of our time, Hanzi claims, at least in the sphere of freedom and advancing in the emotional regimes, is to face down this envy. Its danger is, in Hanzi's mind, actually quite existential. So as, quote, many beautiful minds and hearts emerge to rise to the challenges of the coming period, he says, many others will work consciously but unconsciously but connivingly to stop them. And here I was immediately struck by a figure like Greta Thunberg, who like is just this wonderful kid who wants the planet to survive, and tons of people are just like, fuck you, for no reason. Like, it's pretty nuts. And you got to ask yourself, like, what role is envy playing there? Or more closer to home, people within our own communities who set out to make the world a better place, like day in and day out. I'm thinking of you, Zarina. And who people relentlessly attack and tear down for reasons that don't really make a lot of sense outside of envy. So in today's world, an army of what Hanzi calls mediocre enviers seek to impose humility on others to make themselves feel better. And this, in my interpretation of the book, is also Hanzi's theory of populism, and perhaps includes both right-wing and left-wing populism. So right-wing, I don't know, so-called anti-elitist populism, and then left-wing Twitter mobs. What role is envy playing there? I mean, he doesn't name this explicitly, but it feels like it's woven at least implicitly in the chapter. At least that's what I'm inferring from the chapter, my own reading. So a resentment at experts and great figures who trigger moral outrage among sort of mediocre enviers is likely an increasingly emergent feature of postmodern society. The flip side of this, he says, is narcissism, which he says, quote, both an obsession with exposing narcissism in others and a corresponding increase of actual narcissism as we try to convince ourselves and our surroundings of our worth. And maybe you do that on Twitter. So to counteract this pervasive envy, we must develop through social institutions a sense of true solidarity. May the message ring, Hanzi quotes, I wish you power. I wish you greatness and superiority. I wish you transcendence. He says this is an ethos that perhaps might accompany our transition to a more meta-modern ethos. But there are two sides to this equation, just as there are two sides of an emotional regime. So on the one hand, there is the envier, but on the other hand, there is us, the self, who is receptive to the judgments of others. Hanzi ponders, what is it that makes us bow to the judgments of others to begin with, that leads us to be affected by it, to internalize it, and to respond to it with our own emotions and self-sabotage? The reason, he says, is that it gets us off the hook for our own freedom. There's this sort of corny line that with great power comes great responsibility. Well, according to Hanzi and many philosophers, especially Nietzsche, who's clearly being referenced here, with great freedom comes great responsibility. And as Hanzi says, quote, in slavery to Sklavenmoral, we need not take responsibility for our own highest dreams and aspirations, for our own will, for our own longing or creation and transcendence, for our own greatest potentials and for our sorrows, for all the sentient beings and our identification with society as a whole in its entirety and dialectical multiplicity of perspectives. We can leave that to someone else. So that, he thinks, is why we avoid our own freedom. We are, in other words, terrified of our own freedom. The terrible truth, Hanzi says, is this: freedom is struggle, freedom is terror. It is the terror of facing pure chaos, the pristine meaninglessness of reality, the vastness of potential, and the weight of the responsibility that follows. The solution, though, is not an individual one. One needn't merely become a superior, empowered being who rises above society, merely disregarding their judgments. The solution Hanzi offers is a trans-individual one, of collective advancement beyond envy, among others, and also transcending the fear of our own power, and doing those simultaneously, to build what he calls, quote, co-creative citizenship, in which society at large, its arenas, its institutions, and its functions feel and effectively are as your own home, and you feel comfortable and entitled to participate in any part of it, end quote. In other words, a world where we are deeply invested in the process of shaping and reshaping the world and its institutions, and they, in turn, make and remake us. So in an eminently quotable passage, he says that, quote, we must plunge head on into the mysteries of existence, not as individuals, but as an evolving global network of post-human trans individuals, living in volitionally organized virtual tribes. Unhinged, uninhibited, we would explore with rapacious curiosity, play with religious fervor, worship with trembling devotion, fuck like beasts, dissolving our very sense of the self into the crystal clear night, end quote. We'll leave that chapter and that epic quote there. So in the next chapter, Hanzi begins to tackle equality. And the key thing to say here is that Hanzi sees equality in a far more than economic way. So as we know, a core component of meta-modern politics is improving people's subjective states, as we talked about earlier. And this means approaching equality in a subjective way. Hanzi is clearly a big fan of the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, and his concepts of social and cultural capital. And you'll see where that comes up a lot. But one of the cruelties of our world is that in a society of in a socially unequal world, we desire recognition from the recognized, he says, not from the unrecognized. So if social equality is sort of premised on sort of feeling recognized, as he says it is, then we face a serious dilemma. We want recognition from the recognized, but can be stingy in our own provision of recognition to others. In other words, we're in this sort of self-reinforcing loop. And he's always trying to become conscious of these in ways that previous theories maybe haven't been, or not attentive enough. And so Hanzi takes seriously these sort of self-reinforcing, concentrating processes, and how they operate in social, cultural, and sexual ways. So the chapter examines what he calls 6 dimensions of inequality: economic, social, physiological, emotional, ecological, and informational inequality. So I'll just get into each one of them really briefly. So economic inequality should be familiar to everyone here, but the short of it is that economic inequality is falling globally, but it's rising within rich countries. And we need, according to Hanzi, quote, effective global systems of redistribution. And to get there, we need, quote, a systemic shift towards global governance. And to get there, Hanzi says, quote, we need significant proportions of postmodern and metamodern people around the world, end quote. So for him, he thinks changing people, or changing the economic equation and economic inequality actually is somewhat dependent on also changing people's subjectivity and their culture. So like these things, yeah, they sort of feed into each other. And we debated this a bit last time in our recent discussion about metamodernism. Do we really want to count on the rise of better people as a precondition for economic redistribution? I mean, this sort of flips Marxist class struggle on its head, where, you know, let's liberate ourselves economically and then we'll figure out everything else later. Like that's the main thing we got to do. But Hanzi says that he thinks that we need first to decrease the viscerally felt inequality that his other categories name and describe. So let's talk about those. The next category of inequality, and the big one for him, is social inequality. So social inequality encapsulates what I described before about recognition. Hanzi takes seriously the way that people with lots of social capital experience a much better life, and how people with little social capital have a very difficult time breaking out of their situation and acquiring social capital without already possessing much. So in other words, if you have social capital, it's much easier to get more. If you don't have it, it's really difficult to get it. And this is true sexually too. Like, people want to have sex with people who have sex with people. If you don't have sex with people, no one wants to have sex with you. It's like these horrible self-reinforcing processes that Hanzi's trying to name. And he says, left political theory doesn't take these things seriously enough. And yeah, he touches, as I mentioned, on sort of sexual games that people play and so forth. He also offers a scale of people's social capital that involves considering how many bridges they could lose and still be okay. That's sort of his metric. So at the top of the social hierarchy, he says, you can burn 90% of your bridges without significant losses of subjective well-being. Pretty profound. Whereas at the bottom of the scale, you simply lack bridges altogether. And in the middle of the scale, so 5, you can lose any one major bridge and still manage, though at a lower subjective state of well-being. So just to give you some sense of the scale without going through the whole scale, the differences of subjective experience between these steps, he says, are enormous. The experience, he says, of shifting just 1 or 2 steps in the scale puts you on a whole nother map of lived reality. And it's important to be realistic about this. Okay, so shifting to physiological inequality, this refers to one's body and how this affects one's place and performance in the world. So as Hanzi points out, height, weight, ability, etc., they all make a profound difference in people's lives, from the amount of money they can make or do make to, on average, to the effectiveness of their immune system, to their sexual desirability, and so forth. Inequality, Hanzi says, and this applies to other forms of inequality too, lives in and through the human and animal bodies. And society's institutions can work to exacerbate or combat this inequality. As he points out too, this, like other forms of inequality, interacts with and drives and reinforces other forms of inequality. So they're entangled in this sort of mutually reinforcing space where, if you have a disability, you might not make as much money. If you don't make as much money, you might not have as much social capital. If you don't have as much social capital, it might be hard to have sex, and so on and so forth. So, and that in turn might make you physiologically less well. Like, your immune system might perform worse because you're not having normal sexual or social contact. And so there are all these sort of self-reinforcing cycles he's trying to make us aware of. So the next form of inequality is emotional inequality. So quite simply, different people have vastly different overall emotional existences. Because subjective well-being is core to meta-modern politics and that project, Hanzi takes this one very seriously as well. He says, quote, inner states and emotions are at the center of how inequality is reproduced across all its other dimensions. So he therefore proposes that institutions must be developed and devised to both boost positive emotions and to help people cope with and overcome negative emotions. He says that we need sort of emotional support services that are available to everyone in society from the day we are born to the day we die. So our entire lives, we should have access to these things, and that's true for everyone on Earth. The last two I'll just do together. So ecological and informational inequality, they command very little spaces in his analysis because they're pretty straightforward. But Hanzi effectively argues that certain regions face far more treacherous environmental crises, and that certain people have way less access to quality information. And we therefore require ecological and informational rights, which are guaranteed on a transnational basis because these things operate transnationally. Okay, so on to the next chapter. Hanzi proposes that we need a kind of index of all of these dimensions of inequality, the capital one has within each of these areas, which adds up to what he calls one's total capital. So when we talk about inequality, we can't just talk about economics. We can't just talk about social capital. We need to talk about your total capital. This is kind of like the effective value meme from psychological developmental stages that he talked about in the previous book. And it is only by considering one's total capital that we can create what he calls, quote, deeper equality or multidimensional equality. So Hanzi also insists that equality on its own is less useful as an overall guide than equivalence, or better yet, equanimity. So equanimity refers to, quote, the spiritual and psychological struggle to give up our deeply seated tendency to judge and evaluate ourselves and others in the first place. He states in this basis that, quote, the higher goal of societal development is not so much to achieve, quote, perfect equality, but rather to render the very struggle for equality obsolete. So he then turns to the matter of spirituality and considers that people with more capital, total capital, tend to have access to better versions of spirituality, and how this becomes another means by which people are sort of stratified in a self-reinforcing way. So at the bottom of this hierarchy, is what he refers to as the astrology precariat. So, quote, the magic beliefs of desperate people in a heightened vulnerability, which leads to a cruel commercialization of the human soul. Above this is what he calls the yoga bourgeoisie. So the people who, he says, quote, might dabble a little in astrology and quick fix life-changing courses and eat some silly supplements, but they generally understand that they should keep such discussions to themselves, and they don't sort of spoil their professional lives in the pursuit of these things. Finally, there is this class of people who he calls the Integralists, who, think quite privileged people, quote, who manage to keep a scientific worldview intact in the process of engaging in their spiritual growth and self-improvement. In short, Hanzi thinks everyone should have access to this kind of high-quality self-improvement and spirituality, and should be protected from the low-quality exploitative kinds. Okay, so finally, this section of the book concludes with a consideration of norms. So in the 8th and final chapter of section 1, that's what happens. And here he offers norms as one of the key components for achieving metamodern politics, and ultimately the point of metamodern politics, he says, is cultural game change. So cultural game change occurs, he tells us, when three things happen. The first is that populations develop higher effective value memes. In other words, that the individual members of society develop psychologically in ways that he discusses in the Listening Society. The second thing here is when there are shifts in the intimacy of control, so the emotional regime and the degrees of equality covered in these previous chapters, as we've just discussed. And then finally, 3, what he talks about in this chapter, when there are shifts within the system of norms. Okay, so basically the spheres of psychology, politics, and social life. And those things are intertwined. So all of these inform and influence one another, and you're seeing a pattern here. All these forms of development are always sort of woven into each other, and they therefore cannot be thought of in isolation from one another. So he looks at norms not as something to be abolished, as some postmodern politics sometimes threaten to do, nor as something to be preserved, as conservatives generally advocate, but as a site of cultural struggle. We need, according to Hanzi, better norms. And just like other areas of change, he thinks we ought to be aware of the, quote, way the future exerts a kind of gravitational effect upon the present, end quote. In effect, he begins to anticipate. So specifically, he offers the examples of animal rights, how pedophilia is thought about and handled, and the extent to which our identities are formed in relation to our professional and work careers. So these are 3 areas he thinks are going to have to change quite a lot in the coming years, or he anticipates will change a lot in the coming years. And just to clarify on the pedophilia one, he's not saying that pedophilia will be tolerated in action, but that the roughly 1% of the population who have these urges will be less stigmatized in such a way that they can actually be treated and, quote, openly dealt with in order to actually prevent future harm. So bringing it out from the underground and actually treating it. So just wanted to clarify that one. Anyway, the big takeaway from this whole section of the book that we've been discussing is that we need to combine shifts in the spheres of psychology, politics, and social life in order to create cultural game change, and that we need to do so in a sober, open-eyed way that avoids either game denial or game acceptance. And a major part of this is acknowledging the existing problems concerning freedom, inequality, and political control, and operating with a more complex and less naive vision of these. We should aim to transform these alongside our norms and our own psychologies. Anyway, that's basically the first section of the Nordic Ideology by Hanzi Freinacht. I hope it's useful, and I hope that it gives some summary for those who couldn't read the whole thing. And I guess we can just open it for discussion if that works for people.
That was really good, thank you.
No problem.